This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I have the two economists, Jim Power and Chris Johns, co-hosts of the Other Hand podcast, as my special guests. We chat about a lot of things, including a very real bias that seems to exist today towards the male, pale and stale professionals in the workplace. Let's hear from the male, pale and not so stale, Jim Power and Chris Johns. Jim Power and Chris Johns, the co-hosts of the Other Hand podcast, the Power Economic Duo. How are you both keeping?
Both well, I think. I can't speak for Jim, I can speak for myself. I'm on holiday at the moment, but still working away at this and other things. I'm lucky enough to be semi-retired, so I can mix and match both my locations and my activities. So all well. And how are you, Greg?
I'm good. I'm really good. And I like the idea of this holiday business. It's a really important time, Chris, for a bit of reflection, isn't it?
Absolutely. When you think about the state of the world, one is almost ashamed to be on holiday, actually. You've got to suspend certain of your faculties anyway. The situation in Ukraine, of course, would be at top of everybody's lists. The economic situation, which is our area of supposed expertise, is looking grimmer by the day, with a few shafts of sunlight, it has to be said. And I imagine Jim's got something to say about that as well. But economic growth is slowing everywhere. And the reasons for that, I think everybody knows. They are linked very much to that war in Ukraine, the human aspects of which are more to the fore, I suspect, in everybody's minds. But the inflation that the war has unleashed for commodity prices, and that's not just energy, it's a whole range of agricultural products as well, has added to the post-COVID inflation that we were going to experience anyway as economies were suddenly released from captivity. And we now have a problem with rising inflation and therefore rising interest rates. Those interest rates are designed to slow economic growth, and they certainly are having that effect. But it's more than just interest rates. I think confidence, people's willingness to go out and take risks, spend their money on whatever it is that companies and individuals spend it on. I think people are taking a step back at the moment, and that's contributing to the slowdown. So you've got inflation, slower growth, higher interest rates. It's all looking a bit 1970s, wouldn't you say, Jim?
Yes, it is, Chris. And I guess I'll answer Greg's question first. How am I? I'm good. Working really hard. I guess it's the affliction of self-employment. You're afraid to turn any work down in case no more will come. So really busy. And I'm also doing exams at the moment. So once I finish work every evening at 6 o'clock, I'm back to the desk studying for 2 or 3 hours. I have the last set of exams at the end of June. And at my age, I can assure you that will be the last time I will ever intend sitting an exam again. Apart from that,
Jim.
Yes, Chris.
Jim, let me tell you that when I sat my UK, I've passed 2 driving tests in my life, one in Canada and one in the UK. I took my one in the UK quite late in life, at about the age of 24, 25, and I swore to myself that would be the last exam that I ever did. And as a result, I very nearly lost my first ever job in financial services, because a few days after I started in the City of London financial district in the mid-1980s, I was told I had to do some stock exchange exams. And I told my boss I had sworn to myself that I was never going to do another exam. And he was take it or leave it. And so the last exam I ever did was in the mid-1980s. And I can assure you, I will never do another one again. You're a much braver man than me, I must say.
Yeah, at my age, it's pretty foolhardy, isn't it?
Brave.
And Jim, the Institute of Directors, why now?
For 2 reasons, Greg. One is, I guess, I work with a lot of businesses in many different sectors. And I guess I do economic analysis and, economic impact analysis and so on. for a lot of businesses, a lot of companies. The one thing I've never really understood were the mechanics of business, the financials, stuff like strategy, leadership, all of that stuff. And more recently, of course, ESG has become de rigueur. That's environmental social governance. So I wanted to learn a lot about that. So I really wanted to learn stuff to understand more about the businesses that I was dealing with. So that was the sole motivation. And I guess within that, there was also an element of the last exam I sat was 1989. So I guess there was a sort of a temptation to try and test myself again to see could I actually do it after all that time. But the second reason is, and this is probably an age thing, I wouldn't mind getting a little bit of director experience over the next few years as I glide towards old age and retirement.
Yeah, it's a very good thing for us to be looking at this stage, because I think between the three of us, we've all clocked up a lot of business experience in different ways and life experience, and that's a huge thing. And it's one of the things I want to chat to you about today. And it's funny, Chris, you're talking about Ukraine. I had a conversation last week with one of the top Irish DJs. You know, he hosts one of the top radio shows in the country. And he was talking about Ukraine and he was talking about COVID. And he reckoned there was a 3-week window of people's attention and tolerance for any particular subject. And once you go past that threshold, you just need to shut up about it. So even though what's happening in Ukraine is crushing and it's just the worst possible thing ever, and it goes on, it's so easy for us to kind of tune out. But as you say, Chris, we're seeing the effects of it beyond what we're hearing on the radio with inflation and everything else.
Yeah, when it affects you personally, I think it holds your attention for a wee bit longer. But I agree with your DJ friend that our attention spans, I suspect as human beings, they always have been. But I think for all sorts of reasons, they're shorter than they have been ever, actually. I'll mention why in a moment. But it's often said in places like the Middle East and Africa and other difficult spots around the world that why are you paying so much attention to Ukraine when there's been all kinds of stuff going on here? And your attention span for what goes on in places like the Middle East and Africa seems to be about 10 minutes. What is it about Ukraine that is so different? And I think the answer is it's personal. It's Europe. It's horribly reminiscent of a war that some people still alive remember, and certainly a war that everybody has seen all the movies and read all the books and been taught about in school. European war is something different, I think. You could argue about the morality and ethics of that, about whether or not we should pay equal attention to everything that's going on in the world. But the facts on the ground are that Ukraine is personal, both in terms of that historical narrative. It's also personal in the European context, because we all know, at least those of us that are students of European history, know that the reason why the EU exists at all is first and foremost, and frankly, most of all, as a peace project to stop European wars. Anybody that's picked up a history book about Europe knows that on every page there is a war. Since Columbus set sail for the Americas, or at least what he turned out to be the Americas, France and Germany have fought 17 wars by my count. And you could cite all sorts of different statistics, and that Germany and France on average throughout their history go to war about once every 50 years. So the European Peace Project was established in the ashes of the Second World War to stop war in Europe. And you could argue that in Bosnia and the old Yugoslavia, that there was a failure there, and there clearly is a failure today. So it resonates from a historical perspective, from a political perspective, from the EU's perspective, and it resonates personally because it's affecting us in our pockets. And God bless those people around Ireland and the UK. I know somebody in the UK that's taken in a Ukrainian refugee into their homes. This is personal. And I know why that DJ says that our attention spans are short. I do think that's part of the human condition. A whole separate discussion is that I think that I would applaud an article I read in the Atlantic magazine recently by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, who said that social media has turned us stupid. And I would applaud that sentiment. I think it has. And as part of that process, I think it's shortened our attention span. We can read 140 or 280 characters, and then our attention starts to wander. The demise of the newspaper speaks to the shortened attention span. So yeah, I accept that Ukraine is starting to slip from the headlines, from the daily headlines, but I still think that it's going to resonate for a long time, if only because that personal aspect of slower growth, higher inflation, higher interest rates is going to be with us for quite some time to come.
And Chris, I'm going to put this question to Jim. Is it only appropriate that as us human beings in a country that isn't called Ukraine and is next door to a warring neighbour, is it appropriate that we do suffer a little bit and our fuel prices will go up and that we do feel some effect from a war? And a lot of the time as citizens, we give out and we should get a subsidy from the government because our petrol is going up and our heating fuel. Is that appropriate? Should we suffer and, suck it up, buttercup? Yeah. Some people are being dislodged from their homes and it's not nice. And
I think, as Chris was saying, Greg, that the Ukraine war is resonating a lot more with us in this country because it's having a huge direct personal impact on most of us at an economic level. And it doesn't sound great talking about economics in this context, but I guess we live in an economy that creates a society, so we've got to accept that. But you look at the impact it's had on oil prices, energy prices generally, the impact it's having on food, the impact it's about to have on interest rates. This is a war that has really hit us hard. And I guess there should be no surprise about that, given the economic significance of that part of the world. But my late mother often told me about the experience here in Ireland during the Second World War. And they certainly suffered a lot as a result of that war. Then in 73, 79, when we had a couple of Middle Eastern crises, oil prices shot up, and that really resonated here in this country as well. But then you look at other war and situations of savagery that appear to have a lot less resonance with us. You think about countries like Rwanda and Burundi that experienced absolute slaughter at a massive level in the 70s and 80s. We knew very little about it in this part of the world. Perhaps that had something to do with social media and the absence of it at that stage. You look at what happened in Yugoslavia in the early 90s with the savage breakup of that country. We got the news reports every day, but I don't think people thought about it very much, to be honest. This time round, we're all much more connected, we're much more affected. And I think it's also come as a bit of a shock to people, the manner in which Putin has become such a despot, because over the years, he certainly had at a global level attained a certain level of global leadership. Increasingly, Russia was becoming part of the global political establishment. And what he's done since 2014, but particularly over the last 6 months, has been truly horrendous and has come as a massive shock to people. So I think that has also resonated with a lot of people and come as a bit of a shock. I personally, this week, we're looking at the Leaving Cert and the Junior Cert happening in this country. And I was thinking back to my days when I did the Junior Cert. It was called the Inter-Cert. I did history for the Inter-Cert. Didn't like it very much, sort of learned it off as best I could and got as good a result as I could. But at the first opportunity, I dropped it going into fifth year. So I had no interest in history at that juncture. Perhaps it's because of the way it was taught, I'm not sure. But over recent years, I've become more and more interested and fascinated by history, because the one thing that's very clear is that throughout history, going back to the Roman Empire, the one certainty we have is these periodic bouts of savage warfare. At the moment, I've just finished 3 books. One was a biography of JFK by a guy called Frederick Lagerfeld, and that covered Kennedy's career up to when he became president. And a key part of that was the build-up to the Second World War. Joe Kennedy, his father, was the US ambassador in the United Kingdom, and we had Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Hitler. So there was a lot of resonances there with what's happening at the moment. And in fact, the parallels are quite scary with the build-up to the Second World War and what we've seen Putin do in recent times. And I've read two books about the Spanish Civil War. One is by a guy called Paul Preston, who is an authority on the Civil War period in Spain, called The Spanish Holocaust. And the subtitle there is The Inquisition and Extermination in 20th Century Spain. And that describes the savagery of what actually happened during the Second World War, or during the Spanish Civil War. And I'm just finishing a book now by a guy called Giles Tremlett called Ghosts of Spain. And that's a look at contemporary Spain through the lens of the Civil War. And those two books on the Spanish Civil War demonstrate clearly the horror of what Franco did during that period. So what Putin is doing at the moment, there are many, many precedents for it. And it just shows, once again, the savagery of human nature. I mean, there are no depths to which human nature is not capable of descending in terms of savagery. So I guess with what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment is just a repeat of a lot of history. And
I'm going to jump from you for a second there, Jim. Chris, Jim was talking about his Institute of Directors course, and he was talking about the ESG and how businesses now are expected to behave in a particular way. You know, that profit isn't the sole motivation. So as time is going on, we're all expected to be more PC and conscious, and yet we're having these huge problems. What are you seeing at this moment in time when we're all, supposed to be behaving properly?
I am a director, a very regulated director of a European subsidiary of a London-based financial house. Its European headquarters is in Dublin, and I chair the board in a non-exec capacity. So I'm very, very acquainted with the pressures and the way in which that job is changing in all sorts of ways. And there's also all sorts of ways that I think we can applaud. One is, I think years ago, if you were a non-executive director, it was a sinecure. It was a job for the boys. It was something people turned up to board meetings, they nodded off, they signed a few papers, had a good lunch, and got paid a nice fee. Certainly in financial services, those days have changed because of regulation, and quite rightly so. And the expectations are actually quite onerous. The rules are many and varied and getting more extensive all the time. No complaints, because I think the financial services industry brought it on itself, speaking broadly, not for the firm that I represent anyway. During the great financial crisis, it was inevitable that would be followed by further waves of regulation. And the latest wave is in the environmental, social and governance space. There are draft directives and actual laws coming out of Brussels now that place a wide variety of expectations for people's behavior. And it's going to affect how people's investments do, where their savings are going to go. It consumes an awful lot of time. And that's one particular aspect of governance, is that whether or not we like it, whether or not we think it's the right thing to do, in financial services at least, we are being told this is what we've got to do. And there are other aspects to this as well. Diversity on boards is incredibly important. We are not quite mandated, but almost to always respect diversity when we are making board appointments, to try and get away from those days when boards were just old, male, pale and stale, is the cliche. I was put forward relatively recently, actually, for a board position in the UK, and I didn't meet the first hurdle. I didn't even get an interview. And the job itself, the job spec, read like somebody that it was me. It was my CV in terms of the experience that they were looking for. So I was slightly surprised. And I asked the headhunter, the recruitment specialist who was handling this appointment, and they said, "You're old, you're male, and you're white, and you're just not going to pass muster because of the diversity criteria that this board must itself think it needs." So it does have real impact, all of this stuff. It's going to be more difficult if there's a recession. Boards have to think very strategically about their business, not just the rules, regulations, and the social constructs in which they operate. Jim has already asked me, what advice should you be giving a company if you're involved in a non-exec way for potentially the forthcoming recession? And all of that ESG stuff and diversity stuff and the other things that we have to do, they remain front and center, but the priority becomes survival. And any company that needs to survive a recession needs to think about itself. It needs to think about old-fashioned things like preserving cash. That means not spending, because as we know from previous recessions, the only thing that matters is that you're still there when it's over, because they do end. And it's the firms that have the most cash during the difficult times. And there are various, it's very, very easy for me to say, but of course, companies find that very, very hard to do. And if we all, and the paradox, speaking as an economist, is if we all end up doing that, preserving cash, not investing, not spending, not hiring, preserving our bank balances, if everybody does that, both at the corporate and the personal level, then I guarantee you we will have a recession, because that's what a recession is. It's people stopping spending. So there's lots of things to worry about. But in terms of running companies, the world has changed dramatically in recent years. And I think Jim's experience of doing a chartered qualification to become a director speaks to that. I think it's a very good thing. I would certainly applaud it, because the professionalization of boards, as well as all those other diversity type characteristics, is absolutely essential if our corporate sectors in many jurisdictions are to be better run. Because one of the things, speaking of the UK, for example, there's a lot of academic literature that says that one of the reasons why the UK's economic performance has lagged so badly in certain respects over decades is because of how poorly these companies, a lot of the companies in the UK, are run. And the better run companies are the exception rather than the rule, and that there are colossal management failures. So professionalization of management at all levels, I think, is something that is a topic close to my heart. And I applaud Jim for what he's doing as part of that effort.
Yeah, and Chris, not wanting you, or in a way, not being able to appoint a wise, experienced Chris Johns on a board that needs your CV because of some of the criteria is also a problem. So you mentioned, and it was perfect, thank you so much for teeing it up, male, pale and stale. I was chairing a discussion for a company on diversity, and we were ticking the box on a few different topics. Of course, we had gender, we had race, and we had someone from the LGBT community who happened to be in politics as well. And I know her really, really well. And of course, the whole conversation was about bias. And in the middle of the conversation, she spoke about the politicians, and she mentioned male, pale, and stale, and in a very dismissive way. And I thought, excuse me now, sunshine, you're after demonstrating a colossal bias, whether you meant to or not.
Exactly, Greg. If I can interrupt you there for a second.
Yeah.
If what we're doing is identifying biases and poor behaviors, and I think we are, there have been poor behaviors, there have been biases, and we've all got them. But if what we then do is replace one bias with another bias, we ain't going to solve the problem. We're really not.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm going to throw the ball to you in a second, Jim. And a lot of our conversation is we're getting a bit older, but you have to both go to the cinema. Top Gun, Maverick. He's 61 years of age. He's flying jet fighters. He's getting the cute girl. He's on his fast motorbike without a helmet. You need to go to watch this movie and to feel, do you know what now? I ain't old at all. What do you think, Jim?
Haven't seen it yet, Greg. It's on my list of things to do, but I'm just too busy studying every night to go to the cinema at the minute. But I'll take your recommendation on that. I remember somebody saying to me in San Francisco a couple of years ago that the worst thing you could possibly be in San Francisco at the moment is white, middle-aged male who's heterosexual, that you are the lowest of the low in terms of how you're going to get treated and regarded by society out there. And I think, that view is very definitely spreading to many other parts of the world, along with the whole liberal agenda and so on. I came across a quote from JFK's brother, actually, Robert Kennedy, recently said that what is objectionable, what is dangerous about extremists is not that they're extreme, but that they're intolerant. And I increasingly find this, that the so-called liberals out there are amongst the most intolerant people I come across. They're open to all ideas as long as they agree with their own. That seems to be the mantra. So I think we needed to redress imbalances that existed in business, in society, and the treatment of people. But the risk, of course, is that we go way too far now in the opposite direction, and that you end up by just basically discriminating against another grouping within society. So we need to be very careful. But it certainly makes me think that doing the Institute of Directors, if I was doing it with the view to becoming a director, I'm probably wasting my time, because I don't tick any of the boxes, just like Chris described there a few minutes ago in the UK. So I'm not sure where I'm going to go with it, but at least I'm learning something, which is always good.
Yeah. And Jim, it's one thing not to be ticking the boxes, but I think there's another dangerous trend here, is that when they look at Jim Power or Chris Johns or Greg Canty setting up on stage, giving their wisdom about whatever topic, in a way that generation are dismissing you and writing you off and the shutters are coming down. But we have something to offer. And Chris, to you, when you had that conversation with that lady who was doing the appointments on the board and you didn't even get an interview, how do you feel and what are they missing out on?
Obviously, I would say this, wouldn't I? I felt that somewhat modestly, I say that my CV was just tailor-made for the position. And I pointed this out, and I said that, if boards are going to not look at that kind of experience as part of their recruitment strategy, they are going to miss something. And of course, she laughed and she said yes. And then, of course, you would say that, wouldn't you? But it is the reality on the ground. And the mandate that she'd been given was that there had to be diversity boxes ticked, and as well as the experience boxes. So the challenge that she faced was to find somebody with a CV perhaps not unlike mine, but nevertheless did tick diversity boxes. And I've no idea whether they did or whether they didn't. But everything is relative, Greg. In the old days, an appointment like that would have been made by the board with somebody that they went to school with, or that they were at university with, or that they were in the army with. So I would suggest that, the way in which it's changed is it does have deep flaws, and we need to think very carefully about those flaws. But on balance, I think we're making some improvement. I would just be a fan of blind applications, in the sense that people's CVs are the ones that are read, perhaps even without the names of the institutions that you went to school, you went to university, that your qualifications and experience, and so that your sex, your race, your religion, your height, whatever other qualities are not evident, and that the only thing that is being recruited for is your ability to do a job. I think that we could devote more thought to how we do that blind without giving rise to these biases that we know have existed in the past. Boards in the past on both of these islands have been all boys networks, and that wasn't very good, and that produced a very poor outcome in many, many cases. So it's good that we're changing it, but we just need to be careful that we're changing it in the right direction.
And we need our rules that guide our corporates, to correct the mistakes that have made in the past, to focus on the right things, our ESG. We do need our diversity and inclusion guidelines. We are in an era when it's a woke generation to a degree, and maybe using woke in a positive way instead of a negative way, where you have to be called out for poor behavior, that everyone behaves a little bit badly. So my question to Jim is, with all of that as a backdrop, how in the name of God do we get a Boris? And how in the name of God do we get Trump? And how in the name of God, well, Biden is an older camp. So for all of that male, pale and stale and correctness, why are we not calling out bad behavior when everything else seems to legislate for better behavior?
It's a good question. Looking at the rise of Boris and Trump is on the way back. I think there's a distinct possibility we'll see him lining up in 2024. there can be many reasons for it, but I think one of the reasons is that Trump and Boris are exploiting this wokeism that's becoming so prevalent in society and this political correctness and so on. And they are tapping into people who feel totally neglected by the move towards liberalism, what we've described there. And they're trying to offer them a better solution. And it's people who, I guess, people who probably once had a strong position in society at a social or an economic level, and that as they have been displaced, they're becoming increasingly disillusioned with life. And suddenly you have somebody like Trump or indeed Boris who comes on the scene and offers them some different, some way out of this, an easy solution. So I think Trump and Boris are definitely tapping into this wokeism thing and are exploiting it. And the extraordinary thing is that, the very people who are calling out all of these so-called or perceived bad things are actually the ones that are giving birth to individuals who actually promote these bad things. So there's a huge, I think, chicken egg situation here, if you want to describe it like that. But, and I know people, I go back to San Francisco again, I know a lot of people out there, some on it's a very liberal city and society, as you know, but not everybody is very liberal. There are some conservatives who live there, and they just feel at the moment, they're not being represented by political leadership. And people like that will vote for Trump, or people like Trump.
Thanks a million, Jim. Chris, will you tell my listeners about the podcast and what they can expect on The Other Hand?
The Other Hand was really a bit of fun that we indulged in during COVID lockdowns. Jim and I are very peculiar individuals in all sorts of different ways. And one of the things that we do, and to the present day, actually, not just on the podcast, is that we speak most days over the phone, mostly. We managed to meet up for dinner last week, and that was the subject of one of our podcasts. We would often speak for half an hour on the phone every day. Mostly when I was out for one of my walks during lockdown, and I can't remember who had the idea, but one of us said to the other, why don't we start recording these chats, see what happens? And it was as simple as that. We had no idea if anybody would be remotely interested in it. We sat down, we put some thought into its shape, its design, what we would talk about and what we wouldn't talk about. And it's broad enough in terms of its description, the way we advertise ourselves on our site. We talk about politics a lot. We talk about economics a lot, and a little bit of philosophy, because I think philosophy informs both those disciplines. So we very much focus on those three areas in all sorts of different ways. But it's a freewheeling discussion. If ever you've listened, it can often go off in some very strange directions. One of the many commenters that very nicely get back to us with feedback about the podcast just said we must never stop doing what we do at the top of the show, which is we outline the agenda and then we never get round to the last 3 or 4 items ever. And people are starting to find that quite funny and entertaining. So that's good. We've been incredibly gratified by the response. Because, as I say, we had no idea if we'd have one listener, let alone at the moment we get about 5,500 downloads per episode on average. And a recent one's gone to nearly 7,000, which for a niche little home-produced effort is not too bad. In terms of the Irish podcast charts for business, it's always at or near the top. So it's been great. In a way, it's a hobby. It's dare I say, an old man's hobby or old men's hobby. Some men play golf. We do podcasting.
We need to stop this old man talk and telling you now. Tom Cruise, Maverick, Top Gun. And I know, Jim, alongside the podcast, there's some writing goes on as well.
Yeah, we've set the podcast up on a Substack account, and that enables you to write stuff as well. And I guess one of the criticisms I would have is that we don't write enough, because when we write stuff, it tends to get a very positive reaction. And, a lot of people find it useful, informative, thought-provoking, and so on. But yeah, it's an important part. And to be honest, I think if both of us had more time, we would write a lot more. But, that's something we will work on, because I think having written material alongside the podcast is a good combination. And I tend to write a lot of sort of factual statistical analysis stuff on the Irish economy. And I get people coming back to me saying, that's really useful because maybe they have a foreign parent in a corporate sense who wants to find out about what's happening in the Irish economy. So, this gives them an ongoing interesting synopsis of what's happening here. So, but yeah, the writing is in part. Chris tends to write the more philosophical stuff, and that, I guess, reflects the nature of Chris as distinct from myself. But Chris hired me in Bank of Ireland many, many years ago, and we worked together for 4 or 5 years. Then Chris left, and we maintained contact ever since. And as he said earlier, most days we would tend to talk at some stage about what's going on in the world of economics, financial markets, politics, and so on. And as Chris said, we decided back in February of 2021 that it might be worth recording this stuff to see how it goes. We enjoy it. We have a good chat. We get decent feedback from people. And long may that continue. But I think the important piece here is that as long as we enjoy it, and I also find it a decent discipline, because if we're going on to do podcasts talking about stuff, it means you're going to have to go in and do a little bit of research. So it's another way of making sure that we keep up. Well, sorry, personally, I talk to myself. I have to keep it up to date as possible with what's going on in the world. And that is a good discipline, because it is very easy if you're busy in the middle of something else to neglect what's going on in the real world. So it's a good discipline. We enjoy it. We are very gratified by the sort of response we get. You have been a major supporter of it, and you've promoted it on an ongoing basis. That's been very helpful and much appreciated. But our intention really, I think, is to keep going in the direction we're going. We're prepared to take feedback from people, discuss subjects, and so on. But as long as we continue to enjoy it, we'll keep doing it. There's no doubt about that.
It's a great listen, and you bring that bit of casual thing to it as well, and that bit of chit chat and real life, and I think that makes it really interesting. So it is the Win Happy podcast after all. So I just wanted to finish off, well, we're talking about male, pale and stale, and that dynamic between men, and something that you don't get all of the time, which is friendship. So I want to throw the ball to Chris, and can you talk about your friendship and how important that is?
The friendship with Jim, as you said, goes back to the late 1980s, and I hope he's not listening now, is very important to me. Men have all sorts of relationships, but in my direct experience, which of course I don't know most men, I only know a few, most men have very few close friends. Very few. And I know a lot of men that don't have any. They have some acquaintances, people they might have the odd pint with or occasionally play a game of golf with, but they don't have close friends. I'm very lucky, and I think it is pure luck, that over the years I've accumulated a small handful of very close friends, of which Jim is definitely up there. He's one of them, and it's a friendship that I value. And rather late in life, I came across a study about men. You've probably heard of it, Greg. It's called the Harvard Study. It began in the 1930s, but looked at the Harvard graduating class of the 1930s. And back then, of course, it was only men, because only men were allowed into Harvard back then. Another one of those diversity offenses. And this study has followed that graduating class and subsequent graduating classes throughout the ensuing decades, and has found out all sorts of interesting things, some fairly obvious, some really astonishing. And the most astonishing thing, you can go onto a TED Talk and see the current leader of this project, which is ongoing, talking about the single factor that predicts both how long you live and self-reported happiness in old age. And I won't use that word old again, but self-reported happiness and how long you live. When you control for all the obvious factors like your genes, whether you smoke, whether you drink too much, and all the rest of it, the one single factor that this study shows is that the people in those Harvard graduating classes, the ones that kept in touch with each other and maintained close bonds of friendship, lived longer. And I think that there's a lot in that, and I'm clinging to that as I approach, but not yet. I'm in old age.
So, Chris, I think you're playing a very active role in making sure that Jim is around for the long term. So, Jim, I'm going to let you close off the When Happy podcast today with a little comment back to your buddy, your co-pilot.
Yeah, I'd be pretty solitary. You know, the stuff I do, I go hill walking every Saturday morning out in the Dublin or Wicklow Mountains or wherever I happen to be. I might do 30, 40 kilometers or more in the mountains on my own. I don't listen to anything. I just basically think to myself. I tend to read a lot. I tend to listen to a lot of music. So all of that stuff is pretty solitary. And I don't have too many good friends from my previous life. I joined a book club about 5 years ago with a guy I was in school with in Waterford many years ago who's now living in Dublin. So that's been a good social outlet. We meet once a month to discuss books. But I have a couple of other good friends, and Chris is certainly one of those, because I worked in AIB and I went in there from college, got a job as treasury economist there. On paper, it looked like a great job, but the reality, of course, was that I was working on my own. I was getting no guidance or leadership from anybody. I was hired because AIB felt at the time they needed to have an economist because everybody else did. They had no idea what to do with it. And in the middle of that, I was a year into that, I got invited to lunch by a guy I knew in Bank of Ireland called Mick Sweeney and a Chris. And we went down to a restaurant in South County Dublin, Corkman. They picked up and we went out for lunch. And halfway through the lunch, Chris said to me, "Would you like to come and work for me?" And I said I would, yeah. And I went home that evening after a lot of wine, let's be said, and told my wife that I was actually going to resign from AIB the following day. I was joining Bank of Ireland. And I didn't give it any real thought. I just knew I was doing the right thing because I knew I was going to work for somebody. Number one, I was probably going to get on well with, but number two, and most importantly, somebody that I was going to learn a lot from, which I did over the years I worked with them. And we created this friendship, and it has been maintained ever since. And long may it continue. We had dinner in Dublin last week and a few beers. Really, really enjoyable. And that's probably the problem now, because Chris is in Cardiff, I'm in Dublin. We don't get to meet often enough, but at least we do talk still almost every day of the week. So yeah, it's very important, and I would totally agree with what Chris is saying about, you know, the importance of friendship and that Harvard study. It is very important. It's probably something that I have neglected for many years of my life, but you know, it's good to have it, and I definitely think the podcast has cemented this friendship.
But guys, thank you so much for coming on again today. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I know my listeners can get to listen to you every week. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon.
Thanks a million, Greg.
Cheers, Greg. Anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the When Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.